Hello, and welcome to this episode of Human Rights Magazine. My name is Derek McCush. Esther Dingemans is an expert in programs that respond to conflict-related sexual violence. She worked for several years in humanitarian programs on sexual and gender-based violence in several countries in Africa and the Middle East. She is the executive director at the Global Survivors Fund and the Mukwege Foundation. In this episode, she was interviewed by Coyle and Pamela Zambrano, two of the 5 students selected by the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice at the NYU School of Law to take part in its Transitional Justice Leadership Program. Katie is now an associate in a litigation law firm in Manhattan, and Pamela is an associate in Mexico City.
In times of war, rape makes a particularly effective weapon because it not only destroys its direct victims, but entire communities. Research organizations have also estimated that sexual violence is becoming increasingly prevalent in societies experiencing conflict. Taking the DRC, for example, researchers from Harvard discovered that rapes committed by civilians had increased 17-fold in the past decade. This is despite increased recognition of sexual violence in international criminal law as a crime against humanity and as a tool of genocide. Despite such efforts and increased reparations, sexual violence in conflict continues at astounding rates. In the recent invasion of the Ukraine, for example, the Russian military has been reported to use rape as a strategy and weapon of war and terror. As of the 3rd of June, the Office of United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights had received reports of 124 alleged acts of conflict-related sexual violence across the Ukraine. Many argue that the increase in sexual violence in conflict is due to the root causes of sexual violence itself. Sexual violence does not occur in a vacuum. The root causes of CRSV include gender inequality, discrimination, poverty, and marginalization. Founded in 2019 by Nobel Peace Prize winners Denis Mukwege and Nadia Murad, the Global Survivors Fund aims to address issues such as these. The Global Survivors Fund does this through working with survivors of sexual violence to gain a victim-focused input on how to achieve reparations. Today we are joined by Esther Dingemans, the Executive Director of the Global Survivors Fund. Since 2000, Esther has dedicated her career to the prevention of conflict-related sexual violence and ensuring quality care for survivors, as well as working with UN agencies in Guinea, Egypt, Ivory Coast, Darfur, Colombia, and Syria. Esther has additionally led capacity-building projects in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. Esther's area of expertise includes community-driven projects and holistic care for survivors and survivor-centered reparations. So thank you so much for joining us today, Esther. We really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to come and talk to us here at NYU.
Thank you, Katie, for having me and for shining light on such an important issue that affects us all.
Thank you so much for being with us. So I want to lead in with our first question, Esther, about your journey and what led you to this work. So our first question relates to how you got involved with this very important work. I know you started your career as a social worker in the Netherlands, which eventually led you to work on the prevention of gender-based violence in conflict situations. Could you tell us a little bit more about what led you to this work?
Sure, you're right. I started 25 years ago working as a social worker with refugees in the Netherlands. That's where I'm from. And after 1 or 2 years into that work, I realized that I was probably not made for the one-on-one support. I found it really hard, and especially the suffering from the suffering of the refugees in Holland, particularly that sheer isolation that they lived in while they were really dealing with intense trauma. It made me feel really powerless, and I thought perhaps I can better use my skills by working with refugees in countries where at least they are living together and can receive support from each other somehow. So that's where I started. I went to Guinea in West Africa, where I was working with children from Liberia and Sierra Leone, refugees. And I was really shocked because at the time, Katie, there was not much dialogue about conflict-related sexual violence. It was the time when the first reports came out about sexual exploitation by humanitarian personnel and by peacekeepers. But what I got to learn that was actually the children that were so vulnerable to that type of sexual exploitation and abuse had, in fact, many of them had already experienced sexual violence in conflict before they came to Guinea as part of the war in Sierra Leone and in Liberia. And no one was really talking about that and what made their situation so specific and why they were so marginalized in the refugee camps. So I felt that needed to change, and I started working. The first project was with Liberian teenagers, girls. Often they were mothers to already several children because of the sexual violence that they had endured in their own country. And we started a project to help them pick up their lives and finding a way back into their community.
Wow, Esther, that sounds like an incredible journey that you went through to get involved with this type of work. Even just from your answer there, you've touched on a lot of issues related to sexual violence and conflict, such as the cycle of violence that people become trapped in once it begins. And then also children who themselves are survivors born of rape and conflict. Speaking of this work more generally, could you tell us about the work that you do? And when we talk about the issue of sexual violence and conflict, what is it exactly that we're talking about?
Yeah, that's important. So when we speak of conflict-related sexual violence, it means that we're talking about sexual violence that happens in or around a conflict or after a conflict, and that has a direct or an indirect link with that conflict. So the link, for example, can be seen in that sexual violence is used really to harm or even to destroy an opposing group. You mentioned how sexual violence can be used as a form of genocide in the introduction. It's also used to really terrorize communities, to instill fear in a population, to make them leave, for example. And we see that it is used as a tactic in wars to break the resistance. We see that now in Ukraine to force confessions, often false confessions, to punish, etc. So there's a link directly or indirectly with the conflict. But Katie, perhaps what I find important also to shed a bit of light on is what it actually looks like, because we often talk about conflict-related sexual violence in rather dry terms, perhaps, but it is actually really brutal forms of sexual violence. So mentioning a few examples, gang rape, often sexual violence committed in front of family members, children, including children, rape in public places, enslavement, sexual torture. Often it also involves using objects such as sticks or weapons. It can take the form of genital mutilation. Maybe also important to mention is that it's not only used against women, but also men, and not only women of a certain and men of a certain age, but really old ages. The oldest woman, for example, that I know that was subjected to sexual violence in conflict was 84. But it also targets really young babies, which is horrific. And it's perhaps so horrific that we often don't talk about these details, where I do really think it's important, despite it being so painful and sensitive. But I really feel that if we don't also show that shame and the blame and the silencing, it really remains with the victims. Whereas we should really reverse that and shame the perpetrators for the horrific crimes that they've committed.
Yes, certainly. I feel with a lot of these cases, it sounds as though the shame that really should be shared with the perpetrators is somehow given to the survivors of the terrible crimes. So, moving on to the work of the Global Survivors Fund, could you tell me about the fund itself and how it was created and what the journey was that led to its creation?
Yeah, sure. You mentioned in the introduction that the Global Survivors Fund was founded by Nobel Peace Prize laureates Dr. Denis Mukwege and Ms. Nadia Murad. And the purpose was really to enhance access to reparations for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. But I think it's important to mention that that work builds on the power and the inspiration of a network. It's a global network of victims and survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. The network is called SEMA, which means speak out in Swahili. but it unites women from all over the world, all continents, all ages, all religions and cultures. And it's an activist network, so they really fight for change. They're all women who have either experienced sexual slavery, wartime rape, etc., the examples that I mentioned before. But it's also this network that, when they came together a number of years ago, said we should prioritize reparation. So they actually made a strong call to us to start establishing an initiative really dedicated to reparations for victims of sexual violence in conflict. So since then, we've been working with them in establishing our organization. And our purpose is also really to keep them involved. Survivors, they're really at the heart of everything we do. They're in our board, they're in our technical advisory panel, etc. But most importantly, they really lead on the design of our projects. So that's how the fund came about. Perhaps, Katie, shall I mention a little bit about what we do? Because sometimes it can be a little bit confusing when we talk about reparations, which is really a state responsibility, state or other duty bearers, such as the perpetrators. And they have, of course, the obligation to provide reparations. And what we do is, first of all, we recognize that it is their responsibility first and foremost. And our task is actually to encourage states to take that responsibility. But what we also see historically is that very few states actually do award reparations to victims of sexual violence. It can take generations if they occur at all. So what we try to do is to really work also through grassroots organizations in providing what we call interim reparative measures. But it is projects that are designed by survivors, really starting from the question, what does repair mean to them? What is needed for them? And that often then leads to projects that provide financial support, education grants, business support, medical care, psychological care. So all these elements that survivors need to start picking up their lives that are often completely destroyed.
I guess you've touched on it there a bit, but for the listeners, I was wondering if we could go into the definition of reparations and what we mean exactly when we say that, for victims, what does reparations mean? But I feel like you've described it quite well there, and that it's a way for survivors to pick up their lives after these incidents have occurred.
It's really there's a definition which encompasses the compensation that survivors are entitled to, also guarantees of non-repetition, which could take the form of law reforms, rehabilitation, which could be, for example, the medical, often lifelong medical support is actually needed. But it's really also about satisfaction and recognition. And that is really something that we see with victims from around the world. They yearn for a recognition, for a state offering an apology, but also for their community leaders, members in the community, their own family members, really recognizing that survivors are not to blame, but that harm was done to them, and that for that reason they have certain rights.
That leads me, Esther, to another question. You mentioned that the Global Survivors Fund shows a survivor-led independent fund and the role that can play in providing reparations. But that's not separate, per se, from state-led reparations. And how do you see those two working together, like an independent fund for reparations alongside other support that might be needed or state-recognized reparations? How do those two connect, or how do those two work together, have you seen in your experience?
States sometimes are not unwilling to start the repair process. But what we try to do is to encourage them to speed that process up. And what we see is quite effective in that extent is to just start with civil society organizations and survivors on reparative projects that I just mentioned. But what we try to do then is to engage states really in that process so that our work can act as a catalyst and shows governments, look, reparations are affordable, it's feasible, this is how it can work, but also really demonstrating that life-changing impact on survivors' lives. And that way really motivating the government to scale up that work and set up its own domestic reparation program. So I think the two go side by side. It's the advocacy work, but also the act, really doing now. And then a third pillar of our work is when governments are ready to set up a reparation program, is to give them also that support, technical support, for example, to make sure that these programs are really conducive to what survivors of sexual violence want and need.
That certainly sounds like a very strong form of advocacy, almost advocating truth showing that it is
Exactly.
possible. So it seems very strong. In previous talks, you've addressed the stigma that victims of sexual violence face. And so our next question, I wanted to address why the stigma, in your opinion, remains so prevalent in society today or generally, because I know this is one of the greatest barriers that organizations face when treating survivors of sexual violence.
Yeah, it's very complex, and I think every context is different. And it's true, there's often really deeply rooted societal factors which come into play in stigmatization of victims of sexual violence in different communities. But what you also see is actually the same patterns across the world. Victims are quite systematically blamed and shamed and silenced in specific conflicts. For example, the fact that the enemy was the perpetrator can also lead to a specific form of stigmatization, especially if that sexual violence then led to pregnancies. Often the mothers and the children can then really face particular harsh forms of discrimination, and often lifelong discrimination and injustice. Children being called specific names, often along the lines of enemy child, etc. But I think also important to mention is that we shouldn't be misled and think that this shaming and blaming only happens in certain countries or societies or cultures, whether it's in Europe or in Africa or Asia, Latin America, and so on. We see the same patterns. If you look, for example, at Bosnia and Herzegovina, what happened there, sexual violence was really used as a weapon of war on a massive scale, but it was hardly talked about in the aftermath of that war for years and for years, and most victims felt it was not safe. They would indeed face exclusion if they would openly talk about it. Very little support for them, and all of that really adds to the stigma. Maybe one other thing to mention is that stigma is often associated with the societal norms, etc., but there's an additional stigma, and that we're really learning about that more and more, and that is the stigma that's actually a result of the consequences of the sexual violence itself. For example, victims who suffer severe psychological problems, can't take care of their children, for example, or they've been so injured that they lose their livelihoods, or they are maybe sent away from their families. They live with fistula, etc. All of these consequences really add to that stigma that the society sees them as of less value somehow, and less as a person. And there's actually these forms of this type of stigma, I think, that can be addressed through reparations. I'd like to, Katie, maybe I can mention an example that really struck me, and it's just something that I'm starting to also discover. But last week, I was in Holland, in The Hague, with the same network that I just mentioned, the SEMA network of the Global Network of Victims and Survivors of Sexual Violence. And there were a few women there who had been imprisoned in Syria. What they told me is that they have been subjected not only to systematic sexual violence, often up till they were unconscious. But what also was apparently a common practice there was to put hormones in the water, and which the people in the prison were forced to drink. That has created really immense reproductive health problems for the victims, such as years of delay in their menstrual cycle, but also not being able to have children, early menopause, etc. And that's a form of reproductive violence. But can you imagine that this really adds to the stigma as well? If as a result of this, you can't have children, for example, that in itself is a factor for exclusion. So I think that's important to mention, that aspect of stigma.
It's quite astounding and shocking, the creativity that's sometimes employed in the tactics that are used by perpetrators when committing acts of reproductive violence or sexual violence. And thank you for sharing that case study with us. It's very shocking, but I think it's very important that we know these things. And as the international community, we are aware of these types of things and the new forms of violence that are emerging. I know we were previously discussed some shocking case studies of what people have faced in terms of stigma in their society, and also the issues that stigmatized or those who are stigmatized face when they also suffer a lot of medical issues, and that compounds the issue further. But in one way, there are other stories of success, victims and survivors really managing to reclaim their lives after what's happened. And I think a powerful example of this is what has been seen with the Pansy Foundation, who I know are closely related with the Global Survivors Fund. And I know in previous talks that you have noticed the Pansy Foundation have survivors who are recognized for the struggles that they've overcome, and they're treated as heroes in their communities. So I was interested for you to tell us a little bit about the story of the Pansy Foundation, what the organization is, and how their positive attitudes came to be.
Yeah, it's true. Pansy Foundation really serves as our inspiration in many different ways. But Pansy Foundation started actually as a hospital in Eastern DRC when the conflict broke out there more than 20 years ago. And the hospital was founded by Dr. Dennis Mukwege, who is also the president of our board and the founder of the Global Survivors Fund. He's a surgeon. He still is a surgeon, and at the time he thought he was going to be working on maternal and newborn health, as he was specialized in obstetrical and gynecological care. But instead, unfortunately, he was actually forced to specialize in care for victims of conflict-related sexual violence, brutal sexual violence, like I mentioned before, including in DRC, again, including really small children, older women, etc. And what they soon realized was that the medical care was not enough. A woman whose body might be recovering, but whose spirit really doesn't want to live on at all, can actually not fully heal. And someone who is undergoing surgery, but is actually only worried about children being left alone, children being ostracized, not having anything to eat, etc. Their physical healing is not going to be successful. So they soon realized actually we need to do much more than medical care, but we need to do the whole package, and that's what they call holistic care, and that includes really profound psychological care for the victims. Indeed, also the medical component, but then also thinking about the livelihoods and legal care for those who want to actually pursue justice. So that's the Pansy model. But what I find particularly inspiring in this model is the compassion. I haven't seen that in any of the countries where I had worked before, in any of the projects that I led myself, the real compassion for the victims. The moment that they are entering the system, the hospital, they are treated like heroes, like you're saying, like war victims who deserve to be cherished, who deserve to be supported in all possible ways. And it was in Pansy that it was actually the first time that I really saw something that I'd not seen before, and that was women who are victims of sexual violence standing on stage and saying, yes, I'm a victim of sexual violence. Yes, I have a child born of rape, and I love this child, and I am proud of this child, and I have rights. And then getting a big applause. So that's what I mean when, a very positive model about showing how things should be.
Wow, that's definitely a great way to recognize the struggles that people have overcome, because really victims or survivors of sexual violence, they really are very strong people to overcome this, and then to be able to stand up. It's really fantastic, and to also send a positive message that will hopefully overcome stigma that is so unfortunately seen in society.
And also, if I can add, it's a way to change their story. It's a way to say, I'm not only a victim of sexual violence. I am also a mother. I'm also a woman. I'm also a bunch of different things, and I don't need that label. Oh,
Exactly.
It's a great way to address this kind of violence, and I think that this leads me to the next question. That is, what are the biggest challenges that we are currently facing to prevent reparations for victims of sexual violence?
That's a good question. And I think a lot of it is in political will still, unfortunately, because the frameworks are there. Whereas historically, reparations mostly focused on states. This individual right to reparations under international law is now widely recognized. But unfortunately, governments are not yet taking that responsibility always. It's perhaps also related to the sensitivities of this particular form of violence. Victims not always feeling safe, again related also to the stigma, to come out and to speak about what has happened to them, contrary to what I just described at Mukwege Foundation. And that sort of also leads, or there's unfortunately still an existing belief that sexual violence is a collateral damage of war. And with that, often victims are not even recognized as victims of war. An example, what I find interesting is Kosovo. It's a good example of that. It took 20 years for civil society organizations to actually lobby for victims of sexual violence, which was sexual violence was systematically used, to be recognized as victims of war, to get that status. Whereas, for example, widows, people living with a disability, the veterans, they had already that status of victims of war, but victims of sexual violence didn't. So that's one of the challenges. Then related also, I think, to the political will is states not making it a priority. Often the other reconstruction efforts come first before we start thinking about the victims, the reconstruction of the infrastructures, etc. Can take years and years before governments start thinking about reparations. And then once these programs are established, it's the big challenge is the bureaucracy, the complex bureaucracy around it. Often the procedures for actually accessing then reparations are incredibly complex, not conducive to survivors' needs, sometimes not respecting confidentiality, etc. So there's many challenges.
When you talk about bureaucracy, I'm seeing everything from the Mexican perspective, in which we also have currently a conflict with all the problems that we are having related with security and delinquency. For example, in Mexico, we created a commission to attend specific to victims. And this special state commission, it was created after a legal reform that was enacted to address the problems that victims were facing because they couldn't access to reparations. But now this commission is creating new bureaucracies because you not only need to go to the prosecutor office, you also need to go to this commission. And for the victims, it's so exhausting. Maybe it's easier because, for example, now with this commission, for example, you don't need judicial decisions that says that you face sexual violence. You don't need that. You can go straight to this commission. But even though there are like thousands of different little bureaucracy procedures that now the victims, they just are exhausted. They just face this horrible trauma, and then they have to face all this bureaucracy trauma, a second trauma, this trauma to access to justice.
Yeah.
So there are so many challenges, even once, and like as you said, now that we have all these all these laws, all these international treaties, even though several steps that we have to take in order to get real reparation. And also, I think that's the thing, and I'm sure that we are going to talk about that later. But what is real reparation? What is an effective reparation?
Yeah, and I think what you're saying is spot on when it comes to the process, because real reparations, what we hear from victims, are not only about the end, but it's the entire process that needs to be reparative. And these layers of bureaucracy, but also the attitudes towards victims are sometimes not reparative at all. What we really advocate for, of course, is to develop these projects, these reparation mechanisms and the procedures, etc., to draft them, to really develop them with survivors. That, in our view, is the only way really going forward to avoid that these procedures are not reparative, but even worse, can be damaging.
That's interesting what we've touched on from your examples, particularly often seen in commissions, and that sometimes the process can be re-traumatizing for victims, and there may be an arduous process, like in certain states where there is prohibitive legal fees for communities that really do not have an income per se, and then accessing the legal system. There's so many barriers that victims face. Um, and I think sometimes, and in many cases, actually, even when there may be a successful legal case that's taken, survivors may not be granted the reparations that they're entitled to, even once the court issues those. Um, what do you believe would be the most effective ways to ensure that they are followed through from start to finish?
I think important to sketch perhaps a little bit the reality or the chances that victims truly have to access reparations through criminal procedures, because of course most victims of sexual violence in conflict actually don't have access to justice, to legal justice to start with, because often they can't identify the perpetrators. Perhaps they are from an armed group of another country. They don't know who they are. Often um, they're raped in dark prison cells, etc. So there's many reasons why victims actually don't have access to justice in the first place. But then also the system themselves, right? They're not often set up really to be handling these mass crimes, and especially not in a way that it is really responding to what survivors want and need. But then for those that do go through, that do really start a process and pursue justice, I think one thing that is really important is to start looking at this from a reparation lens from the very beginning. So that means, for example, not only looking at the offenses, but also really documenting the harms. And then start talking with victims about what repair means to them from the onset. Yeah, I think those are the comments there. But all in all, domestic reparation programs, so where there's no court involved, I think is the answer for the majority of victims. They still come from the duty bearers, from the states, and that's important. Survivors really need to hear that acknowledgement from states that their rights were violated, which is a form of reparations. Um, yeah, that is, I think, that's also where the Global Survivors Fund really puts its focus, to make sure that no victim is left behind.
And Esther, I know there that you mentioned as well that it's very important that reparations are incorporated as early as possible. And one example that comes to my mind currently, unfortunately, is the conflict in the Ukraine, as an example of a crisis situation where reparations or actors are trying to incorporate reparations as early as is possible.
Yeah, I think there's an opportunity there. There is really what we hear from victims: reparations come too late, too little, too late. Of course, the effect of reparations is biggest when survivors need it most, and that is often quite soon after the crimes were committed, and certainly not generations later. So we really argue for paving the way for reparations early on in a conflict, even. And I think this is where the Ukrainian government has an opportunity. They're showing quite some openness to start thinking about a reparation framework for victims of sexual violence right now, but also for those who reparations are still outstanding as the victims of 2014, 15 and beyond. And I think there's an opportunity there to really also show other countries, the international communities, reparations need to come early.
And also, Esther, I have another question because what you are saying, I mean, I think that generally what we used to think, now that paradigm is changing, is that reparations are access to justice, and access to justice, what does that mean? I don't know, criminal law, for example. We need, for example, also enacted new laws. Which law? A victim's law. Yeah. We need, people used to believe that there was a list that you just have to check. Victims have completely different needs, each victim. So, in how do you address all these needs in these programs that are trying to address the challenges that the victims are facing in the early stage? Because maybe one victim needs, I don't know, education, house, food, or maybe one victim I don't know, one woman wants to start to get access to justice, and she's looking, for example, not criminal law, but let's say a completely different kind of justice, let's say administrative. I don't know. So how do you actually create a program that will address these kind of challenges?
Mm. I think again, it's really about collaborating with the victims themselves. We call that co-creation. It goes much further than consultation. It's really working together as equal partners, understanding what victims really want and what would serve them best, but also benefiting from their expertise, from their creative solutions, etc. And one of the challenges, for example, that we often are asked about is what about victims who will come forward pretending that they're a victim of sexual violence, but actually they're not. What we really see in our project is, first of all, it doesn't happen very often, but second of all, these solutions and how do you prevent that? They can only be really developed with victims themselves. It's them in our projects coming up with the ideas on how do you go about the verification and accreditation, etc. So when it comes to what victims want, it is really talking to the victims. And what we see in most of our projects is that many victims actually uh, do have similar priorities, specifically within a given context. So, for example, something that comes back again and again is the request to support to set up a business to make a livelihood again. That's often seen as the very first step to also start exiting that continued cycle of stigma and violence. And with that financial support as well. So not just the training, but also actually the money that will allow them to set up a business, for example. The other thing that strikes me is that all victims are asking for education for their children. The children are often the first ones that they start talking about when people speak about what does reparation mean to you. So we see a lot of commonalities, but there also needs to be really room for flexibility. And with that, develop reparation programs with victims groups. That's for me really key.
Our discussion today is on sexual violence in conflict, and how to end that stigma for people in society. But I believe that for survivors of sexual violence, it's actually stigma is something that people face or tend to face the world over. And I was wondering if you had any input on what maybe can be done in society more generally to combat this type of stigma that people do face.
Yeah, it's a big theme, of course. Absolutely. Sexual violence in conflict is tied in with sexual violence, gender-based violence around the world. And the victim blaming and the shaming, etc., is not unique to conflict settings. It happens all around the world. And I think, thankfully, we're seeing change there. We're seeing a bigger movement of people that really stand with survivors, that support them, and that start blaming the perpetrators and shaming the perpetrators publicly in the media, etc. And that's really what we need everywhere. And I think that's key. I don't the ending impunity, because it's also this impunity that just sort of maintains that blame with the victim instead of the perpetrator. So I think we need to keep our maintain our outrage against all forms of gender-based violence and sexual violence in conflict and outside conflict. We need to keep talking about it, raising awareness about what is happening, raising our children, condemn the perpetrators and also those that are allowing the violence to happen. But of course, that will come with a revolution potentially, and really shifting attitudes. No longer blaming victims, and global movement to end gender-based violence. That I'll be part of it.
It certainly seems like great progress has been made in recent years. A lot more has to be made, but hopefully things will, with advocacy from organizations such as the Global Survivors Fund, begin to make that journey and make that progress. In terms legislatively, I guess in international law and international criminal law, what do you think can be done in terms of prevention?
Well, in prevention, I think there's some quite interesting work happening, led by academia, particularly looking at the causes of conflict-related sexual violence, understanding those causes, which can then feed into the design of prevention mechanisms. It's really important. So we need to look at that seriously. But again, what I like to say that victims are often really left out of the picture when it comes to studies, when it comes to international law. So really looking at the victim's perspective, that I really think there's a lot to gain there. Victims are no longer always silent, and giving them that space and the floor to really participate is really important. But also holding states accountable. I think states need to hold each other accountable for implementing and living up to all the agreements and that they've signed up to, and all the laws and regional um, mechanisms, etc., that are already in place. Why are governments not living up to their responsibility? And I think holding each other accountable, that's really important going forward. And I'm quite hopeful that we will see more of that in the future. Perhaps an example that I can mention when it comes to states encouraging each other to take the responsibility and holding each other accountable. What we've seen over the last decade is really, and rightly so, is, for example, when there's a country in their reconstruction phase after a conflict, that international donors request that reintegration programs are set up for children associated with armed forces or formerly associated with armed forces. And that's really important. But we don't see that same conditioning and commitment when it comes to the victims. So, for example, one country that is supporting the construction of another country saying, okay, you're getting this loan, you're getting this support, but you need to set up a reparation programs for the victims of sexual violence and other grave crimes. Those are quite concrete things that I think that can happen in terms of everyone taking responsibility.
And that leads me to another question, Esther. From an international scale to a personal scale, what can people do to assist in the fight against sexual violence and conflict? What can the everyday person do?
Well, I think every person in their everyday life can take little steps to fight sexual violence. and gender-based violence that we see occurring around us everywhere. So that's part of that, really changing that culture. And that culture is connected all around the world. So that is one thing. But I also really think educate yourself about what is happening in conflict. We talked about it at the beginning. Of course, there's very grave forms of sexual violence that are currently being committed in at least 10 countries in the world. We don't hear about it enough. We don't see about it enough. And that's partly due to the sensitivities, but it's also the will. So I really think that everyone needs to help raise awareness about this is what is happening. It's brutal. And it requires actually a much larger outcry. The outcry that we see now in Ukraine, I think everyone is contributing to that, no? On social media, by talking about it with your friends, in the family. We need to do that for every time sexual violence is used as a weapon of war in a conflict. And I think we all have a responsibility there and can make a contribution.
You said that there are only not, for example, development banks. They have an opportunity there, but also I think about, for example, Africa or Latin America, that they have the International Human Rights Courts. Do you think that in the role of the International Human Rights Courts is important, and that there is an opportunity there to increase the rights for victims who have faced sexual violence?
You know, whether it is international courts, national courts, international justice mechanisms such as the ICC, I think there is need for a global trend to start putting reparations on the agenda. For generations, not only have victims been waiting, but also we haven't spoken much about reparations. Like I said, the frameworks are there, the UN principles are there, but we haven't prioritized that. And courts haven't either. It's always come as an aftermath after a judicial process. And I think that needs to change. And that's where regional courts can really make a contribution as well, which will hopefully trickle down also to domestic judicial systems. So that reparations actually becomes something very normal. We now often talk about prevention and response. And in my view, it should be prevention, care, response, and reparations.
And Esther, keeping an eye on the time, I was wondering if there's anything else that you would like to add today to our discussion.
Not really. I think we've touched on a lot, and I hope what resonates really is that we need to stand with survivors. That is really what reparations is also about, and not only in certain countries, but all around the world. And I think another key point maybe to re-emphasize is that we need to move to making co-creating with survivors, with survivor movements, network, etc., not as an exception, but really as the new normal and the way forward.
Yeah, so you've certainly given us a lot of food for thought today about things that not only the international community can do, but we as everyday people can do to try and take steps to support those survivors. And we'd like to thank you for joining us today and sharing all your wonderful insights, and also just to thank you for the excellent work that you do more generally in your advocacy and all that you do to work with and advocate for victims of sexual violence.
Thank you, Katie and Pamela. It was really a pleasure talking to you, and thank you very much for your interest in this topic.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Human Rights Magazine. The podcast is brought to you by the Upstream Journal. I invite you to consider supporting the program and the magazine with a contribution through PayPal as you explore other episodes.